Okay, so before we get into this, I want you to all do something for me. Pause this video and head to Twitch and see if you can find someone streaming a competitive video game that isn't muting the game and playing their own music over it. See, this is kind of a big problem for music in video games, but to really get down to the bottom of this, we're gonna have to backtrack a little. So back when I was a kid, oh my god, I can't believe I just said that. Okay, so back when I was a kid, video games tended to have a single player and a multiplayer option. If you had a fancier game, that multiplayer option might have been online and let you play with strangers over the magic of the World Wide Web. But what's important to note here is that the multiplayer experience was tied to a single player game, or what we now call the campaign. Now, me, being the most popular kid in my school, never played games like Halo on multiplayer. I just got unhealthily attached to the single player storyline and Martin O'Donnell's fantastic score. But to those who played the multiplayer version of the game, and only the multiplayer version of the game, I'm talking about the people who got like over 1,000 hours in the Halo series, but still think that Red vs. Blue is actual footage from the campaign. Those people still had access to that phenomenal score. It wasn't until the advent of like the MMORPG, which always just means World of Warcraft, when the concept of a video game that was exclusively multiplayer and online really began to cross people's minds. Well, WoW and EverQuest, but we both know who won that decade-long game of chicken. And even in games like WoW, you still have a soundtrack, because even when playing with other people, WoW still, to this day, pushes its story and gives composers great opportunities to flex their compositional muscles. And when people realized, hey, we can just make a game where we only PvP and don't have to deal with dialogue boxes, esports was born. Okay, it actually started in the mid-90s with Quake, but you came here to hear about music and not the history of video games. So now we have esports, games that are completely devoid of offline single-player and focus exclusively on competitive play. And I gotta say, writing music for these online multiplayer games is probably one of the most difficult things you can do. Alright, now just to clarify, when it comes to video games, I consider the sound design and all of the audio to be a part of the music, because music is defined as a series of organized sounds. It's why the Grammys have that spoken word category. It's also why I consider all the sound effects in those old school NES games to be very simple, unchanging leitmotifs. So if your game has a solo campaign, you can almost copy and paste all the same musical material over to the multiplayer side of things. But with these newer games that have no offline single-player story, all the music you write has to function around what the players are doing instead of more rigid cues and checkpoints. So how do you deal with this mess? The truth is, nobody really knows, but everybody's taking a shot at it. So first off, you have this guy, Mike Moraski. He's one of the big sound geniuses behind Valve. And in this presentation where he talks about leitmotifs in Left 4 Dead and minimalist compositions in Portal, he mentions that as a means of not having players mute Counter-Strike and just play their own music on top of it, he did two things. First, he made footsteps audible. Now, this might not seem like a huge deal at first, but now your player has to keep the sound effects volume higher than the volume of their personal music if they want to have a chance to hear their enemy coming around a corner. And two, they only play music at the beginning and the end of a round. By only playing music at the start of the round that quickly fades out, the music gets out of the way before the player engages their opponent and is going to need to start listening to those audio cues like footsteps. And by only playing music after the bomb is planted, you're developing tension at the end of that round that also tells the player how much time they have before the bomb goes off. Great stuff. And that works really well for first-person shooters, but some other competitive genres have still been struggling with how to just not get their players to mute their game. Because on one hand, you don't want to just have the same music looping over and over again in the background, but you also don't want to leave your players in this void of silence, because that's really going to take away from the experience. So as a means of walking the razor's edge, both Dota 2 and League of Legends have audible pings that you can use to communicate with your team. If you can't hear them, you might end up missing them and you won't be able to coordinate an attack with your team. So like Counter-Strike, if you want to play your own music, you have to keep it quieter than the in-game sound effects. But in terms of score, one does insanely better than the other. Dota 2 has multiple music cues for when you die, for when you respawn, for when you fight Roshan, and it's great because the music doesn't just move with the ebb and flow of the match, it gives auditory cues to the player that might help them know what's going on in the map at any given moment. So what the shit, Riot? Do you have any idea how great it would be if I got a little jingle every time someone got ganked? I'm not super good at staring at the map while trying to CS and harass and file my tax return or whatever the hell else Nightblue's telling me I gotta do while I'm in lane. Like, I know that Baron has a global scream when it dies now, and that's really cool, but why not have something more engaging than just having the announcer mumble something whenever a turret goes down? But to their credit, Riot released a legendary skin for their champion Sona, which allows the user to switch between 3 custom soundtracks in the middle of a game. But even then, you still see streamers playing that skin for the looks, and they aren't actually listening to the music. And as great as it is to have an engaging, almost procedurally generated soundtrack that moves with whatever's going on in the match, you still see and hear complaints from the community that after like 50 matches, even the music that persists in the background can get boring. So how do you actually fix this problem of music in esports and in other multiplayer games? Well, like I said, we haven't really got there. It's baby steps, where you just have to add small amounts of music wherever you can to kind of try and add dimension to the game. So far, one of the best examples of a lot of small pieces of music that tend to keep out of the way of gameplay that I've seen is Overwatch. Like while you're loading into your map, you get a specific piece of music that represents where in the world you're playing. Then, once you've selected your character and the round loads, you're treated to some preparatory inspirational music that immediately ends as soon as the door opens, so as to not get in the way of the actual gameplay, which is pretty much what they did in Counter-Strike. Also, similar to Counter-Strike, Overwatch has you listening for enemy footsteps so you know what's coming around the corner. And again, like Counter-Strike, they also have a built-in voice chat to help you communicate with your team. But, just like in Dota and League of Legends, Overwatch also lets you communicate with in-game emotes and dialogue, just like those pings. And on top of that, Overwatch uses dialogue to let you know when an enemy or ally is ulting based on what dialogue you hear. And then again, taking another page from Counter-Strike, Overwatch plays a track as the payload is moving to the next checkpoint, or the game is about to end, or however long it takes to resolve overtime. It still has a little track for the death cam, and even on top of all that, you get that super recognizable play of the game music that you hear in all the trailers and promotional material. But even with all that under its belt, you've still got problems. Like, have you ever been in a really even match where neither team is able to make any progress, and you've been in this match for what seems to be hours, and you respawn only to walk back to the fight with no music and almost complete silence? Every time that's happened to me, it's just proven how important it is to have something there to maintain the energy of the match. So, are we at a point where the music is really effective in all of esports? Nah, not even close. Why don't you get a musical cue in Baron or Dragon spawns in League of Legends? But at the same time, how are you supposed to avoid the repetition of players listening to your battle music for 12 plus hours a day? Like, for all the shit WoW gets, when you hear your queue just popped and you're ready to go to your instance or your battleground, but what are you supposed to hear once you get there? And with that unmitigated fiasco that was the Summer Games promotional series that left many a fan frustrated without the rarest skin of their favorite champion, why doesn't Blizzard implement theme music packs to be played when your character is loading or in the pregame area? Or maybe unlockable play of the game soundtracks to play when you get that one really cool McCree ult? Or hell, why not unlockable dialogue options that lets you pick what your character says when they ult? Like how Mercy says different stuff depending on her skin. Like, yeah, it's high noon is tons of fun, but why not reach for the sky, draw, or there's a snake in my boot to really help own that version of McCree that you're playing? Here's another idea. Why not, instead of making us press tab to see who's on the other team, or as I like to do, just wait for the Korean Widowmaker to clear my sinuses up a little bit? Why not just have a member of the opposing team say something threatening as soon as they walk out of their base? Like, I'm not saying have all 6 people on the enemy team just scream their names at once, but I'm coming for you, mon ami, when Widowmaker comes out of the base, or even when an enemy player switches to Widowmaker and then leaves the base, might add something to the fluidity of the game. There could be more, and there isn't, but why? Because every aspect of an esport revolves around balance. Just look at how Blizzard tried to work with the Overwatch competitive series. It struggled so much. They basically just wiped it and said, we promise to do better next season. Like, any and all of these changes could shift the balance and suddenly ruin one of the most engaging aspects of the game. Like, if Widowmaker really did have a line that she said as soon as she left the base, maybe the opposing team could counter her before she even gets a chance to make a play. So there's a real risk to changing any aspect of a game that's designed to be an esport. But even on top of all this risk of adding to a game that's quite frankly balanced on the head of a pin, when you ask people why they won't give it a chance, they all tend to say the same thing. They're just going to mute it anyway.